withdrawing from
What is this one?
withdrawing from the World Health Organization, sir?
Ooh, that's a big one. World Health ripped us off. Everybody rips off the United States, and that's it. It's not going to happen anymore.
President Donald Trump has notified the World Health Organization that the United States is officially withdrawing from the body.
We will make America healthy again.
Robert F. Kennedy.
The independent presidential candidate and possible election spoiler, now a supporter of former President Donald Trump.
Don't you want a president who's going to get us out of the wars and who's going to rebuild the middle class in this country?
Former President Trump campaigning today with RFK Jr., who gave up his bid for the presidency to endorse Donald Trump. Trump is now promising that RFK Jr. would have a major role in the Trump administration when it comes to women's and children's health.
And don't you want a president that's going to make America healthy again? And I believe that that vaccines play a critical role in healthcare. All of my kids are vaccinated.
A real honor for me to introduce Robert F. Kennedy Jr., take the oath of office and officially become our Secretary of Health and Human Services.
I, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. Secretary.
Lately, I've been receiving many questions about my opinion on Trump. Many people are curious whether I agree with the idea that Trump will save America, and perhaps even the entire world, from big pharma, pseudo-pandemics, and mass vaccination programs. To get to the bottom of this question, I suggest we take a look at the facts. When Donald Trump announced the U.S. withdrawal from the World Health Organization in 2020, it sparked a strong reaction. Many saw this move as a principled disagreement with the WHO's policies, its role in fueling the COVID-19 pseudo-pandemic, and the imposition of draconian measures worldwide. When Trump withdrew the U.S. from the World Health Organization again in January 2025, during his second term, this event was celebrated by many. It seemed that Trump was determined to continue opposing corruption and the pseudoscientific decisions of this organization. However, it soon became clear that Trump's true motives were not what they had been perceived to be. In his speech on January 25, 2025, Trump emphasized that the reason for the U.S. withdrawal was not a disagreement with WHO policies but rather the high cost of participation. The U.S. was paying the organization $500 million annually, while China, with a significantly larger population, contributed only $39 million. According to Trump, when the WHO later offered to lower the U.S. contribution to $39 million to bring the country back, he refused, not because of ideological opposition, but because his initial decision to leave had become so popular that reversing it could have damaged his reputation.
You know, they offered me at $39 million. They said, we'll let you back in at 39. So we're going to reduce it from 500 to 39. I turned them down because it became so popular. I didn't know if it would be well received even at 39. But
at the same time, in that very speech, Trump acknowledged the possibility of the U.S. rejoining the WHO if the organization, as he put it, cleaned things up a bit, revealing that he sees no fundamental problem with the WHO itself.
But maybe we would consider doing it again. I don't know. Maybe we would. They have to clean it up a little bit. But China pays $39 million.
The only concerns that matter to him are financial conditions and the impact on his image. It is important to understand that despite official statements about cutting WHO funding in 2020, the U.S. never actually withdrew its support for international vaccination programs. One of the main recipients of U.S. funding remained Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, which was founded with key support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and works in close collaboration with the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and UNICEF. In 2020, the Trump administration funded Gavi with $1.16 billion for the period from 2020 to 2023. Gavi performs the same functions as the World Health Organization when it comes to vaccination. It funds procurement, organizes the supply and distribution of vaccines in low-income countries, supports national immunization programs, and promotes the idea that mass vaccination is a moral and medical obligation for all nations. In 2020, this organization transferred $370 million to the World Health Organization, effectively sustaining its operations. Moreover, in December 2020, the U.S. Congress allocated $4 billion for the COVAX program organized by Gavi, the World Health Organization, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. These funds were used to purchase and distribute COVID-19 vaccines in low-income countries. Thus, the U.S. not only continued financing the global vaccination system but also secured guaranteed multi-billion-dollar contracts for Pfizer, Moderna, and other COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers. After his return to power, Trump once again demonstrated the same stance. Shortly after his election victory in November 2024, he had dinner with Bill Gates, discussing vaccines, HIV treatments, and new initiatives for their funding.
Have you met with Donald Trump since the election?
Yeah, I had a chance to go have a long and actually quite intriguing dinner with him. He, in the COVID days, accelerated the vaccine innovation. So I, was asking him if maybe the same kind of thing could be done here. And we both got, I think, pretty excited about that.
Trump also did not overturn Biden's decision to approve a new funding package for Gavi for the 2026 to 2030 period, which increased U.S. support for the organization by $420 million compared to the previous fiscal period. This means that despite all the rhetoric about fighting globalist structures, the U.S. has continued to fund Gavi and COVAX, both of which work closely with the WHO. Moreover, immediately after taking office as president, Trump announced the launch of a large-scale and costly project called Stargate. One of the key goals of this project is the use of artificial intelligence to develop personalized mRNA vaccines against cancer.
One of the most exciting things we're working on, using the tools that Sam and Masa are providing, is a cancer vaccine. Once we gene sequence that cancer tumor, you can then vaccinate the person, design a vaccine for every individual person to vaccinate them against that cancer. And you can make that vaccine, that mRNA vaccine, you can make that robotically, again, using AI in about 48 hours. So imagine early cancer detection, the development of a cancer vaccine for your particular cancer aimed at you, and have that vaccine available in 48 hours. This is the promise of AI and the promise of the future.
This unscientific technology, which I will cover in detail in a future piece, is no different from the COVID-19 vaccines and will lead to a massive number of side effects and deaths. What makes Stargate even more alarming is the powerful structures behind its creation. The project is being developed and promoted by figures such as Larry Ellison from Oracle, a corporation specializing in databases and cloud technologies, closely linked to the Pentagon and U.S. intelligence agencies.
Oracle co-founder Larry Ellison predicts AI surveillance will be part of our everyday lives in the future. During a recent Oracle Q&A, Ellison said AI will soon play a major role in monitoring society through a vast network of interconnected cameras, including security systems, police body cams, and vehicle dash cams.
Everyone would see it. Your body cams will be transmitting that. The police will be on their best behavior, because we're constantly watching and recording everything that's going on. Citizens will be on their best behavior because we're constantly recording and reporting everything that's going on.
Ellison's vision is for AI to analyze data from this network of cameras in real time in an attempt to prevent crime while also tracking and influencing public behavior for a safer society. However, the idea raises serious privacy concerns. Critics argue it could lead to a surveillance state with constant monitoring infringing on personal privacy rights.
And Sam Altman from OpenAI, a company focused on artificial intelligence and collaborating with government entities, and other key players from major IT corporations and the military-industrial complex are also involved. These structures are directly connected to digital surveillance, military technologies, and biotech experiments. The development of mRNA vaccines against cancer requires an unprecedented collection of genetic information and biometric data, making this project a part of the global surveillance and control system. Companies like Oracle and OpenAI are not just technology developers. They are the primary beneficiaries of the digital transformation of medicine, gaining access to vast amounts of personal data under the pretext of fighting cancer. The reality is that Trump has never been and is not a true opponent of the World Health Organization or globalist structures. Instead, he reallocates resources, collaborates with key figures in the pharmaceutical industry, and promotes the same technologies that pose a threat to the health of millions. It is also crucial to understand that the withdrawal of the US or any other country from the WHO does not mean that pandemic scenarios are no longer possible. Lockdowns, quarantines, and mandatory vaccinations were not imposed by the WHO itself but by individual countries, which used WHO recommendations as justification for their actions. The pandemic system already exists independently of the WHO. Key players such as the World Bank, Gavi, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, pharmaceutical corporations, and their loyal media outlets can initiate a new emergency situation at any time. In my upcoming video, I will provide a detailed analysis of which structures control pandemic scenarios, how they operate, and why leaving the WHO does not solve the problem. We will discuss what can truly put an end not only to fake pandemics but also to the entire practice of vaccination. Another aspect that deserves special attention is that Trump is actively promoting the idea of the laboratory origin of SARS-CoV-2.
Trump would take to this podium to brief the American people on COVID-19. He suggested that COVID very well may have came from a lab in Wuhan, China. And many members in this very room mocked him for that, said he was spewing conspiracy theories. He was not. We now know that to be the confirmable truth. It took many years for it to come out, but the president was right in this instance again.
At first glance, this might seem like an exposure of the official COVID-19 narrative. However, in reality, such statements only reinforce the false agenda. As I explained in detail in my video Lab Fairy Tales about a non-existent virus, SARS-CoV-2 has never been isolated. Its so-called genome is merely a digital model created on a computer. All discussions about its laboratory origin are based on the analysis of this fabricated sequence. By supporting the myth of laboratory viruses, Trump reinforces fear of fake threats that will be used to justify new pseudo-pandemics. Moreover, this rhetoric serves as preparation for new manipulations. If people have been convinced of the existence of one laboratory virus, they will be more willing to accept any version of new threats allegedly created in biolabs. This is strategically important for continuing the politics of fear, which sustains both the pharmaceutical and political systems. Some believe that Trump is truly opposing pandemic control measures because he nominated Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for the position of Secretary of Health. At first glance, this seems like a move toward exposing the pharmaceutical industry. However, Kennedy has never been against vaccines. He has repeatedly stated that he is not an anti-vaxxer, but merely advocates for safe vaccines.
My only argument, I've never been anti-vaccine. I'm called anti-vaccine because that's a way of kind of marginalizing and discrediting me in the view of the public, but I've never been anti-vaccine. But what I've said is I'm pro-science and pro-safety.
In January 2025, as a nominee for the position of U.S. Secretary of Health, he said, "I am not anti-vaccine and not an opponent of the industry. All my children are vaccinated. I advocate for vaccine safety."
News reports have claimed that I'm anti-vaccine or anti-industry. I am neither. I am pro-safety, and I believe that that vaccines play a critical role in healthcare. All of my kids are vaccinated. I've written many books on vaccines. My first book in 2014 The first line of it is, I am not anti-vaccine, and the last line is, I am not anti-vaccine. So now I'm subject to this new form of censorship, which is called targeted propaganda, where people apply pejoratives like anti-vax. I've never been anti-vaccine, but everybody in this room probably believes that I have been, because that's the prevailing narrative. Anti-Semitism, racism. I have never advised Black Americans not to receive vaccines. At one point you say I'm anti-vax, and that's a bad thing. The other moment you point out that all my children are vax. I'm fully compliant with the vaccine schedule myself, except for COVID. I took flu vaccines for 20 years straight. I have never been anti-vax.
Jerry, would you recommend that parents get their children vaccinated against HPV?
I recommend that children follow the CDC schedule, and I will support the CDC schedule when I get in. Senator, I support vaccines. I support the childhood schedule. I will do that. The only thing I want is good science.
By talking about safe vaccines, Kennedy supports the practice of vaccination instead of exposing it as scientifically invalid and based on the false germ theory of disease. Safe vaccines are a myth. No technology can make them safe, because the body does not need vaccines, and they interfere with its natural functioning. The idea of safe vaccines is simply a way to preserve the practice of vaccination while giving it a more friendly image.
Our plans are radical transparency and returning gold standard science.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. presents himself as someone seeking to restore the gold standard of science. It is precisely for this reason that he sees himself as the best candidate for the position of U.S. Secretary of Health. He claims that he will make decisions based solely on evidence, and that his goal is to conduct a scientific review of health policy to fight disease using strict scientific standards. Trump promotes his appointment in the same way, claiming that Kennedy will help bring transparency back to the healthcare system. However, a legitimate question arises. If Kennedy truly follows a scientific approach and values evidence, why is he openly ignoring one of the most fundamental questions of our time, the lack of real proof for the existence of viruses? Some might assume that Kennedy is simply unfamiliar with this issue, but that's not the case. He is well aware that there are many researchers who criticize the methods virologists use to prove the existence of viruses. In fact, in April 2022, journalist Eric Copolino directly asked him about this topic at a public event. He asked how Kennedy would respond to the fact that governments around the world, when replying to official Freedom of Information Act requests, failed to provide any evidence of viral isolation from a sick patient's sample. Instead of offering any kind of answer, Kennedy first dodged the topic and then said, "I should have just kept my mouth shut and not answered that question at all." Later, in private correspondence, Kennedy admitted that he didn't want to spend his time, energy, and credibility on exploring this subject. He compared the lack of evidence for viruses to conspiracy theories about 9/11, stating that even if it's true, he sees no point in raising the issue because it would damage his reputation and political goals. So, instead of using his scientific and legal background to analyze the problem, he brushed it aside and even regretted responding at all. Just imagine the situation: you claim to be a fighter for truth in medicine, a supporter of the scientific method, and then you come across a group of researchers pointing the absence of any scientific evidence for the existence of viruses. They clearly demonstrate that the methods virologists use to prove the existence of viruses do not meet scientific standards. For anyone truly interested in the truth, this issue would be a reason to investigate further. Especially since it's not difficult to understand, all one needs to do is carefully examine the methods used by virologists. This is something absolutely anyone with an average level of intelligence can grasp. Moreover, a vast number of resources have been created to help even those far removed from science understand this topic in record time. To that end, I highly recommend watching my lecture The Scientific Vacuum. The absence of the scientific method in virology, which thoroughly explains what the scientific method is and why virology has failed to prove the existence of viruses. as well as my documentary The Truth About Measles. The Truth About Measles is the only investigative documentary in the world that offers the most scientific and detailed refutation of any claims regarding the existence of the measles virus and the necessity of measles vaccination. But why isn't Kennedy addressing this? If Kennedy is truly fighting for science, shouldn't he show interest in such a crucial question? Shouldn't the fundamental foundations of virology be re-examined when well-argued doubts have emerged? Isn't it the duty of the U.S. Secretary of Health to verify whether the existing evidence for the existence of viruses is actually based on real science rather than assumptions and computer models? If Kennedy genuinely wants to reform healthcare, the first step should be an honest and open investigation into this issue. But instead, he chose to completely distance himself from it. This means that under his leadership, there will be no restoration of scientific standards. Instead, the old pharmaceutical industry strategy will continue, based on blind belief in dogmas. The reason Kennedy ignores this issue is obvious. Acknowledging the non-existence of viruses would destroy his core political strategy. Kennedy has built his brand on the concept of safe vaccines. If it's recognized that viruses are not the cause of diseases, this would automatically eliminate any need for vaccination, even in the supposedly safe form that he promotes.
If we want uptake of vaccines, we need a trustworthy government without any mandates, because people trust their government. That's what I want to restore to the American people and the vaccine program. And all vaccines are dropping, and they're doing that because people don't believe the government anymore. We need good science, and I'm going to bring that in. I'm going to restore trust, and that will restore vaccine uptake.
Analyzing his career and statements, it appears that Kennedy was cultivated from the beginning as a prominent figure within the anti-vaccine movement, in order to later use his influence to control protest sentiments. Let's recall the timeline of events. 2000s, Kennedy builds an image as a fighter against corporations, defending the environment and public health. This earns him public trust as an independent and honest figure. 2010s, he begins criticizing the pharmaceutical industry and vaccines, but never questions the practice of vaccination itself. He only calls for clean and safe vaccines. 2020s, his popularity in the anti-vaccine movement surges amid COVID-19. He becomes a leading voice in the protest movement against mandatory vaccination, but his stance remains moderate. He advocates not against vaccines, but for their research and improvement. April 2023, Kennedy announces his candidacy for President of the United States, significantly boosting his public profile. October 2023, he leaves the Democratic Party, presenting himself as an independent fighter against the establishment. At the end of 2024, Robert Kennedy Jr. suddenly drops out of the presidential race, leaving his supporters with no alternative and effectively pushing them to support Donald Trump. This no longer seems surprising when you consider that his campaign has received millions of dollars from billionaire Tim Mellon, one of Trump's biggest donors since 2023. This fact allows us to take a new look at Kennedy's entire strategy. Leaving the Democratic Party and eventually capitulating to Trump begins to look like a pre-planned operation to split the electorate and hijack the protest movement. January 2025, Trump nominates him for U.S. Secretary of Health, despite Kennedy having no medical or administrative qualifications. It's logical to assume that if Kennedy, with his anti-vaccine image, truly posed a threat to the system, he would have never been allowed near power. But if his mission is to reform vaccination, rather than abolish it, then his appointment as Secretary of Health makes perfect sense. The greatest fear of the pharmaceutical system is that people will fully realize that vaccination is fundamentally unnecessary. That's why a vaccine reset is needed, and to carry it out, they need someone who is trusted by the anti-vaccine movement.
And all vaccines are dropping, and they're doing that because people don't believe the government anymore. We need good science, and I'm going to bring that in. I'm going to restore trust, and that will restore vaccine uptake.
Most likely, Kennedy will now initiate the development of supposedly new, safe vaccines. These may be based on emerging biotechnologies, including CRISPR methods, technologies in which Kennedy himself has invested money. Instead of allowing people to realize that diseases are not caused by viruses and that vaccination has no scientific foundation, he will offer them a new illusion that now, vaccines have become safer. As a result, people who were ready to abandon vaccination altogether will voluntarily accept these new shots, believing that everything is now under control. In this way, the vaccine industry will not only survive but gain a renewed wave of trust and public support. On February 13, 2025, Donald Trump signed an executive order to establish the Make America Healthy Again Commission, headed by Robert Kennedy Jr. This initiative has been presented as a historic milestone. The commission is expected to finally conduct an impartial investigation into the causes of chronic diseases in Americans over the past 2 centuries, as well as the impact of vaccines, electromagnetic radiation, glyphosate, microplastics, and other toxins. At first glance, this may appear to be the long-awaited exposure of crimes committed by the pharmaceutical and chemical industries. However, a closer look at the composition of the commission raises serious concerns. How can we speak of an unbiased investigation if there are no independent researchers, scientists, doctors, toxicologists, activists, or representatives of civil society on the commission? Instead, the investigation will be carried out by the very same agencies that for decades have approved toxic products, suppressed research, and served corporate interests, such as Food and Drug Administration, an agency that supports pharmaceutical companies and approves toxic drugs while ignoring their side effects. Environmental Protection Agency, a body that allowed the pollution of water, soil, and air with toxic substances such as pesticides and microplastics. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the main pillar of mass vaccination policies and the pseudoscientific concepts of virology. National Institutes of Health, an agency closely tied to the pharmaceutical industry, which funds research that serves corporate agendas. Is it really logical to expect these organizations to fully expose their own wrongdoings? This situation is akin to a trial in which the criminals are tasked with investigating their own crimes. Creating commissions to investigate crises has long been a tried-and-true method for managing public opinion. Every time a major environmental or medical scandal is exposed, the U.S. government announces the launch of an investigation. But what actually happens in the end? They promise to examine all the facts and hold those responsible accountable. They drag the process out for years, creating the appearance of action. They publish a report filled with phrases like insufficient data or further study required. A few low-level individuals are sacrificed to create the illusion of justice. The real culprits go unpunished, and the toxic products remain on the market. This has happened dozens of times. For example, when evidence of pesticide toxicity emerged, regulators launched investigations but did not withdraw the dangerous substances from the market. When certain medications were found to cause deadly side effects, the FDA promised to reevaluate them, yet continued approving them. When cases of scientific fraud came to light, commissions admitted to isolated violations, but did not overturn the decisions based on that research. Now, amid growing public dissatisfaction following COVID-19, we see the creation of the Commission to Restore America's Health, following the exact same script. If the Commission were genuinely seeking the truth, it could not consist of agencies that have spent decades serving corporate interests. A real reform must include a complete ban on the participation of corrupt agencies. No FDA, EPA, CDC, or NIH. Their involvement renders any investigation meaningless. Establishment of an independent commission includes scientists, doctors, toxicologists, environmentalists, and activists with no ties to pharmaceutical or chemical corporations. Involve independent researchers who have exposed corruption in the pharmaceutical industry. Mandatory disclosure of corporate data. Publish internal corporate documents revealing the true safety profiles of their products. Release suppressed studies showing the side effects of vaccines, drugs, and chemicals. Withdrawal of toxic products from the market. Immediate ban on substances and drugs that have already been proven toxic, such as glyphosate, fluoride, PFAS, and vaccines. Conducting an audit of all pharmaceutical products approved in the last 50 years. criminal prosecution of the guilty, criminal cases against the FDA, EPA, and CDC for covering up the crimes of pharmaceutical companies, hold accountable those involved in data falsification and suppression, revision of scientific dogmas, exposing the myths of virus existence and the benefits of vaccination, re-examine the infectious disease paradigm, which is built on unproven models. But none of this will be done because Trump and Kennedy have no real interest in genuine reform. The Make America Healthy Again Commission is not an investigation, it's a performance. A real investigation is impossible if it's conducted by those who created the problem in the first place. History shows that regulatory agencies have protected industry interests for decades. This commission will give people the illusion of change, but it will not eliminate the root cause of the crisis. It is important to pay attention to whom Trump has nominated as Kennedy's deputy. That person is Jim O'Neill, a technocrat and investor connected to major digital and military-industrial structures. At the time of this video's creation, his nomination had not yet been confirmed by the U.S. Senate, but there is every reason to believe that, like Kennedy, he will be approved for the position. A closer look at the background of the man nominated as Kennedy's deputy reveals that O'Neill previously served at the Department of Health and Human Services under President George Bush, where he helped advance legislation that allowed for emergency authorization of medical products without completing full clinical trials. It was precisely this measure, implemented as early as 2001, that paved the way for the mass rollout of experimental mRNA vaccines during COVID-19. O'Neill also played a role in fueling the avian flu panic between 2004 and 2006, assisting in writing speeches for the U.S. Secretary of Health, who cited the apocalyptic projections of Neil Ferguson, the same mathematician whose models predicted millions of deaths and the collapse of civilization due to COVID-19. These false mathematical calculations became the basis for lockdown policies around the world. The avian flu panic in the U.S. led to the creation of BARDA, an agency granted the power to purchase medical products in bulk without verifying their effectiveness. One of its first decisions was the mass acquisition of the antiviral drug Tamiflu. It was later revealed that the Tamiflu stockpile was a scam, as the drug proved to be completely ineffective and highly toxic. O'Neill, serving on BARDA's advisory board, supported this decision, setting a precedent for similar schemes that would later unfold during the COVID-19 period. Jim O'Neill's core idea has always been to eliminate the requirement for proving the effectiveness of drugs and vaccines. He has repeatedly stated that all medical products should be released to the market without any evidence of efficacy, and that their effectiveness should be evaluated only after rollout, by experimenting on the population. This policy aligns perfectly with the interests of biotechnology companies, especially those promoting mRNA technologies. Eliminating the efficacy testing phase would give these companies free rein to flood the market with untested products and implement them in people's lives without the need for any mandatory standard. And they wouldn't even need an emergency use authorization, like during COVID-19. Here, we encounter yet another contradiction. Kennedy claims to demand full clinical trials to weed out unsafe or ineffective products, while O'Neill proposes abolishing such trials entirely, justifying it in the name of deregulation. Moreover, as Kennedy's deputy, O'Neill would oversee the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and other key agencies. In reality, if the Senate confirms his nomination, it will be Jim O'Neill, not Kennedy, who runs the Department of Health and Human Services. Trump himself has implied that Kennedy will merely serve as a polished public face, while O'Neill will wield actual power. Jim O'Neill is also connected to Palantir Technologies. Palantir was originally developed as a digital intelligence tool and is now one of the main contractors for the CIA, NSA, Pentagon, FBI, and other U.S. security agencies. Its systems are used by Ukraine and Israel to identify strike targets and are also employed by major pharmaceutical corporations to implement digital patient surveillance tools, and to develop predictive systems based on individuals' digital footprints. Throughout the COVID-19, Palantir's systems were heavily utilized to track reported cases and manage vaccination-related data. Yet, its involvement in healthcare continued beyond that point. Today, Palantir is firmly embedded within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, managing its core functions, including the CDC and other agencies. One of Palantir's programs at the CDC is a system capable of declaring the next pandemic before people even show symptoms. The idea behind this concept is that instead of nationwide lockdowns, future closures will target specific cities or communities based on wastewater data and digital health monitoring. All decisions within this program are made by artificial intelligence, not by humans. If artificial intelligence determines that a particular city should be locked down, authorities will be able to impose restrictions without transparency or any possibility of appeal. Palantir emerged from the controversial Total Information Awareness Program, launched by the Pentagon and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. This system was considered so dangerous in terms of mass surveillance that even mainstream media acknowledged it as a threat to Americans' constitutional rights. Following public backlash, the program was privatized and handed over to private companies, and thus, Palantir was born. Now that it's no longer a government project but a private corporation, society offers little resistance to its deep integration into critical institutions. But the core purpose of the program remains unchanged. The creation of a predictive control system where algorithms not only identify potential criminals but also so-called infected regions, which may face lockdowns and restrictions before any symptoms even appear. This is an extremely dangerous tool, especially considering that Palantir is already actively testing predictive policing systems in several U.S. cities. The very concept of crimes before they occur or illness before symptoms emerge leads directly to total digital control. And if artificial intelligence decides you are a threat, how will you prove otherwise? Now imagine what happens when someone from Palantir gains power in the Department of Health. Jim O'Neill is a close associate of Peter Thiel, the founder of Palantir. Thiel has spent years promoting O'Neill for top roles in this sector. His appointment to such a high-level position under the current Trump administration signals that the U.S. Department of Health is now in the hands of technocrats tied to Thiel and Silicon Valley, who have propelled O'Neill's career to expand the influence of Palantir and biotech corporations over the U.S. healthcare system. If Kennedy truly stands against pharmaceutical tyranny, how could he agree to work side by side with someone like Jim O'Neill? Why hasn't he spoken out against O'Neill's nomination, and why, on the contrary, has he enthusiastically supported him, even calling him the ideal partner? This is not just a rhetorical question, it reveals the central contradiction in Kennedy's actions. And it is the main question he owes his supporters an answer to. Kennedy is not naive. He has spent decades criticizing pharmaceutical corporations and the American healthcare system. He fully understands that O'Neill represents the very deregulatory agenda that will give pharma companies free rein and escalate digital surveillance. If Kennedy was truly an independent figure, he would have publicly opposed O'Neill's nomination and, if O'Neill was appointed, would have refused the position of Secretary of Health. If, instead, Kennedy agrees to work with O'Neill, it can only mean one thing. His entire fight against pharmaceutical corporations is part of a carefully orchestrated performance in which he merely plays the role of the opposition, while in reality doing nothing to stop the implementation of their agenda. True change will never come from politicians like Trump. They have no interest in dismantling the pseudoscientific theories on which the modern system of control is built, because it is precisely these theories that allow them to manipulate people, impose emergency measures, enrich pharmaceutical corporations, and strengthen the power of globalist structures. But it is in our interest, as people who want a better life for ourselves, our loved ones, and the world we live in. Exposing the lies about viruses, vaccination, and infectious diseases is not just a scientific issue, it's a matter of our freedom and our future. That's why we must not rely on politicians who are tied to the system. We must take it upon ourselves to conduct research, spread the truth, and develop alternative scientific approaches. Real change will begin only when people stop waiting for a leader to come and fix everything, and instead take responsibility into their own hands. Relying on politicians tied to globalist networks, like Trump, means remaining trapped in a cycle of manipulation and empty promises. sharing truthful information, investigating the real causes of illness and their solutions. This is what leads to change. True freedom begins with the realization that change lies in our hands, not in the hands of those who serve a system that feeds on fear and ignorance. In a few months, my new investigative documentary titled The Truth About Measles will be released. The Truth About Measles is the first documentary in the world to present the most detailed, scientifically grounded, and unparalleled refutation of any argument in favor of the necessity of measles vaccination. The documentary is nearly 4 hours long and is divided into 3 episodes. There is no other material that addresses the topic of measles in such depth. It covers the history of measles, the creation of its diagnosis, and explains how the medical establishment has historically created the illusion of measles epidemics and convinced the public that vaccination reduces the incidence of measles. The documentary provides the most detailed analysis of the 2016 German court case regarding the existence of the measles virus, where it was demonstrated that the measles virus does not exist. This court case is still the subject of heated debates today. Any attempt by fact-checkers and vaccine advocates to discredit the outcome of this case has been completely refuted in this documentary. The documentary examines the experiments that have tried to prove the contagiousness of measles to verify the claim that measles is the most contagious disease in the world, as well as the so-called complications of measles and whether measles actually causes them. You will understand the real causes and purposes of measles symptoms, learn what to do if you or your children contract measles, and free yourself once and for all from the fear of measles. If you want to silence any doubt about the correctness of your decision not to vaccinate yourself and your children, and understand why virology is a pseudoscience, make sure to watch this documentary. Measles is a crucial element in virology, without which it is impossible to comprehend the scale of this fraudulent scheme. All of modern virology, as we know it today, as well as modern vaccination practices prior to the era of mRNA vaccines, began with measles. Measles is the largest knot in the entire field of virology, which I have carefully untangled for the understanding of the general public. To ensure you don't miss the release of the documentary in English and other languages, subscribe to my Telegram channel. You'll find the link to the channel in the description.